affirmation of danger. Back to history. In conclusion, we will show how Heidegger's seriousness, by adopting a non-Hegelian theory of the end of history that traces back to Dostoevsky, develops an alternative program to Kojève's irony. In fact, Heidegger takes up a position that in many respects is quite close to that of the underground man. The phenomenologist of inauthentic existence and profound boredom is also to some extent an observer of the Crystal Palace, although he does not call it by this name, instead describing it with such terms as enterprise, mediocrity, inauthenticity, ambiguity, machination, and technology. He is likewise convinced that the lifestyles of a technological, analgesic world oriented to happiness allow quote-unquote human metaphysical potential to lie idle, to put it bluntly. In contrast to the Hegelian ironist, Heidegger cannot settle for a politics of the cheerful re-animalization of the human being that would send the latter off to find amusement. The reason for this is to be found in an interpretation of satisfaction that allows Heidegger to move beyond Dostoevsky and Kojève. In Heidegger's world, to be satisfied requires more than merely offering evidence of the inexhaustibility of human negativity, or delighting in occidental and vesperal wisdom. Here it is necessary for you to wake up from ontological complicity and change yourself into a messenger and an outpost of being. Heidegger ontologizes avant-gardism by tying the possibility of satisfaction to the possibility of a calling by which you can be sent ahead as a vanguard of being into its own affairs. We have already seen above that temporalized being, which, in a mood's timelessness, addresses our respective contemporaries, initially wishes to be immersed in an enveloping boredom bath. From this bath emerges the bizarre figure of an avant-garde that is called upon to push forward into the heart of boredom, that is, into a most profound having nothing more to do. At the same time, Heidegger does not want this to be understood as a calling for the oblomovization of the West. To those who can and wish to hear it in the dialect of boredom, the being of the 1930s says something of this sort: I need you for my newest project, to prepare existence to cease with its previous history-making. You should occupy yourself in our resigned elite by exposing history as essentially a collective flight forward and by helping turn it against itself. To make a long story short, we now wish to show how Heidegger accepted this paradoxically coded assignment and wrongly deciphered it. He succumbed to a misunderstanding, because he obviously had a second voice in his ear that gave him conflicting instructions. What we are here calling a second voice is an ensemble of anthropological concerns that pertain to the human being's transformation in technical civilization. Technological civilization. We find this articulated in the only slightly later anthropological work of Arnold Galen. The young Heidegger is involved in a discourse on the essence of modernization as a process of relief. With the utmost presence of mind, he grasps that progressive relief as undermining the basis for its own métier, philosophy as metaphysics. If philosophy is supposed to entail the urge to be at home everywhere, the manner in which this urge is presently diverted into other directions is nevertheless unmistakable. Due to its satisfaction with enlightened, touristic and informative expedients, in Heidegger's time as well as today, it leaves the streambed of philosophy behind and trickles away into the institutions and activities that assure existence's modern welfare. From this perspective, so-called globalization, which has characterized world discourse for decades, forms only the most current mode of the non-philosophical redirection of the urge to be at home everywhere. On this analysis, present-day humans tend to want to be relieved of metaphysics and self-reflection. Heidegger is not prepared to stand back while that happens, without formulating an oppositional manifesto. This manifesto is rooted in a grand diagnosis of time, in which Fichtean and Kierkegaardian motifs converge. If, in his lectures on The Characteristics of the Present Age, 1804, the birth certificate of the philosophical diagnosis of time, Fichte had defined the present moment as the age, quote-unquote, age of complete sinfulness. In other words, as rock bottom after which we can only proceed upwards. And if Kierkegaard, in his polemics of the 1840s against the conformism of the zeitgeist, had portrayed the public as a collective non-person, and as the source of all irresponsibility, from which the later portrait of Das Man, the they, in Being in Time is supposed to have come, then Heidegger, in the era of the Black Notebooks, was devoted to an increasingly in-depth inquisition against the activism of modern technological civilization. Research into the sources of evil in the world culminates in a serious philosophical reconstruction of communism, as an oligarchic party that is ruled by the few. Communism embodies the innermost tendencies of modernity. The Russian contribution to an all-consuming techno-pragmatism consists in launching the still reigning, quote-unquote, machination. Ubiquitous machination is common to the British Empire, the French Republic, Americanism, Bolshevism, and National Socialism. Sometimes even the Jewish contribution to the mobilization of all things through the intention to use them is evident to the diagnostician. It's also obvious from a few embarrassing reviews of the Black Notebooks that they can easily be reproached for quote-unquote anti-Semitism. It would be wiser to determine the soundness of Heidegger's diagnosis that the accomplices of machination, metaphysics and technology, really lead fatefully to the devastation of all things, whether the agents of devastation bear the names of concrete historical collectives or not. The second voice that Heidegger hears demands that he connect philosophy's concern to that of the burden, and indeed, since relief already represents a fait accompli, that he connect philosophy's concern to a repeated and reconstituted burden. Thus repetition is also the soul of thought. It aids the thinker in the task of encountering the issues that thought is engaged with, which are always difficult, without false ease. If modern relief per se includes the temptation to forget philosophy, then it is to be identified as the enemy, with the battle against it determining the fate of philosophy. Since it has undeniably occurred, and hence radically transformed the premises of thought, even if academic philosophy misses this entirely due to its prevailing ignorance, it is now a matter of thoughtfully considering the issue of burden. Burden after relief amounts to re-burdening. I would like to argue that re-burdening is essential to what may be called, quote-unquote, Heidegger's politics. Even the evocation of boredom in the lecture course, The Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics, can only be appreciated if we understand it to be part of a procedure of re-burdening. The new avant-garde collective will not convene in order to be bored until the end of time, as an élite of the empty, in the manner of a certain Asiatic misunderstanding of Heidegger, but to prove that even today there are still human beings who do not take the easy way out, although most succumb to the temptation of ease. Since the folly of being open to the mood of present truth is the hardest thing to expect of contemporary human beings, the way for quote-unquote us to reach our own epoch leads through just such a gauntlet. Being initially requires us to be there and to be willing to bear the burden of the absence of evidence or of being gripped. The reward that is revealed in quote-unquote our awakening to the sense of homesickness for forgotten being. But because our present time is not able to formulate a task in positive terms, the historical project that could grip us must lie ahead of us in a future that is still unclear. The crucial onto-historical questions are thus: what really lies ahead of us? What will have enough force to carry us away, inspired by a new belief? What exactly is happening today that we are needed as media? A hint of great things to come is suggested by the pronoun, quote-unquote, us here. The searing advent in the Freiburg Lecture Hall in 1929 is formally linked to an ontological advent through which we are supposed to allow an imminent sense of being happen to us in positive terms. Of course, Heidegger is just as unsure as anyone as to how a new imperative of being might manifest itself, but he is confident that he has understood how we need to be prepared to go through such an advent. Namely, we must be ready to be re-burdened. Hence, it is just fine with him if, quote, all that is great stands in the storm, end quote, as he put it at the end of his rector's address, thanks to a questionable translation of the ancient Greek. Anyone who has joined the avant-garde of boredom and already exposed himself or herself to the truth of the present has met the prerequisites for making a stand at the front line of the raging storm, ready for assignments from the future of truth. With that said, we should clarify that Heidegger's interest in introducing the so-called leader principle into academic life, which forms the nucleus of his rectorate, was mainly to introduce the principles of trainer and training into existence. Training means structuring our life into a series of exercises that increasingly burden us, and this is precisely how the principle of re-burdening is disseminated among the relieved and disoriented. Quote-unquote, Heidegger's exercise remains inscrutable as long as we do not also recognise the entry of sport into post-historical politics. Sport is precisely the form of exertion in which nothing is really at stake, that we nevertheless engage in to restore a sense of what is ultimately engrossing. The political field too, in its own way, makes this turn towards sportification, Versportlichung, whether as democratic fair play, or as recent forms of serious political sport that demand dictatorship in order to drive off those who have been relieved of burdens. Mussolini was not entirely wrong when he identified the source of fascismo to be a feeling of horror when confronted by a comfortable life. This should unquestionably be interpreted as the key term for Europe in the 1930s. It articulates the Western Catholic and martial sportive response to the objections of the underground man having distracted existence in the Crystal Palace. In fact, even relieved Western human beings rebel against being surrounded by offers of happiness. But their rebellion does not quite reach the state of willful destruction, as Dostoevsky suggested, although a few such examples are not lacking. Rather, Western rebellion occurs as an act of freely burdening ourselves. That is, as sport. By 1933, Heidegger's idea of leadership already implied a dictatorship of the trainer, who ensures that we remain in shape, as the theme for history's next chapter, although it's quite unclear what particular match history will require us to play. The way in which the ontological advent takes on the atmosphere, Stimmung, of a finals match, in which the team of discomfort is matched against the team of comfort, should now at least be evident. From Heidegger's perspective, what happens here is always solely a match for the truth of being, which is played in the arena of current universal time. He is now ready to interpret we as a national team, and thus comes to be associated with Hitler, to whom he is prepared to offer a role as assistant trainer of the national team, although incidentally it is clear that Hitler too only represents a subordinate medium, who can have no idea of how he might contribute to the team effort. Heidegger actually uses the specific example of the Nazi movement to articulate his expectation that history might not have ended in the silent fog of boredom. He wagers everything on the hunch, indeed the claim, that while those of us who are honest continue to keenly feel that history is at a standstill, being is gathering itself in preparation for an epochal leap. And this leap needs us, since it is the gesture by which we collaboratively make history, understood existentially. The leap is precisely the act of moving forward, which is an essential part of mediumistically collaborating with what is coming. It needs us because it will not happen without our boldness. Our boldness follows from the realization that when we are in danger, the only way out is to keep moving forward. Thus, to conceptually formulate quote-unquote Heidegger's politics, we would have to demonstrate how a post-historical reburdening that turns life struggles into a kind of sport merges with being horrified by the end of history, which at the same time was interpreted as the end of philosophy. This convergence does not need to be described in detail here. Its strategic purpose to compel progress or a new start to history is all too clear. Anyone who has interpreted being as time would have conceded the annihilation of being, if he or she wished to acknowledge the end of history. And this was not something Heidegger could do. He insisted on claiming that he stood in the midst of an advent that was about to reveal something compellingly new and great. History must thus remain open, and its end, although present as a current possibility, is to be postponed again and again. Tant pis for those affected, if nothing more attractive than National Socialism is currently on offer to promote the advent. Yet when was history ever very particular in recruiting its agents? We should now be able to see that Heidegger's doctrine of the historicity of being is not intrinsically connected to his membership in the National Socialist movement. As is well known, similar ideas have characterized the behavior of militantly leftist authors such as Merleau-Ponty and Sartre. Like a master from Meßkirch, these thinkers were convinced that we do not stand over and against a world that is historically in motion, but that, quote, the world in fact envelops us, end quote. At the time, all that Heidegger's thought could do was relate to a sufficiently heroic movement upon which it could project its positing of recurrent history. This could just as well have been something like Roosevelt's New Deal or the Russian Revolution, had the thinker's fate been to exist as an American or a Russian in those days. Like so many who were scandalized by that epoch, Heidegger felt compelled to raise the question, where is great history going here? And when he received the answer that it was heading, quote-unquote, for the brown shirt revolution, well, he was ready to devote his energy to that promising hypothesis. Though we repeatedly find the claim that his thought must be National Socialist because he was a member of the party, this position is unjustified, as irksome as his rectoral address must seem in critical hindsight. In any case, we learn more about the intentions of interpreters from such interpretations than we do about the author in question. What really matters is that Heidegger revised his onto-historical over-interpretation of the National Socialist movement shortly thereafter, because he was able to realize the true nature of the company he was keeping, based on his own experience. He even had to make an objectively ironic about-face when it became evident to him that this very moment represented an explosive form of the world of boredom. It was impossible to see it as a turning point in the history of being. Rather, the will to power's assault on everything quite clearly revealed an essential feature of a subjectivism that is forgetful of being. If one complements this with the view of the underground man, then the irony of Heidegger's attempt to participate in the opposite of what he intended becomes quite pronounced. Hitler's politics, seen from underground St. Petersburg, were simply an attempt to bring the Crystal Palace under German control, and to guarantee the new master's comfort by adding a new deck onto the eastern wing. Instead of a new dispensation of the occurrence of truth, what followed was a return to slavery, and manhunts as a kind of post-historical power sport. What was supposed to be an escape from the comfortable life turned out to be the cruelest possible establishment of a secure perimeter around the Crystal Palace. By 1934, Heidegger knew that he had failed to become a catalyst of the Advent. From that point on, he was careful not to further dabble in forced attempts to help along epochal turning points. He began to emphasize the necessity of waiting, and to look around for new allies with whom he could form another quote-unquote we, and make alternative arrangements for a deferred epoch. Poets now became important to him, Hölderlin in particular, because they provide key information on the problems we face in forming the avant-garde of a wretched future. Because emphasis is now placed on the poetic disclosure and arrangement of the world, the concept of the work becomes significant. Indeed, it occasionally takes centre stage in Heidegger's reflections during the middle stage of his quote-unquote path of thinkings, Denkwegs. As hollow as it may have appeared to its first audience, this concept can help us bear in mind that the occurrence of history in a collective is not merely constituted by moods, but even more by works to be accomplished, whether they are works of state or works of art. Both should be thought of as vessels for truth's emergence into the light. The poetizing of state, the poetizing of art, indeed, ex negativo, even the poetizing of the Crystal Palace and its anticipated renovations shifts to a truth-historical perspective through works. There is a high price to be paid for this alliance with poetry. Heidegger has to acknowledge that even metaphysical philosophy, which he initially wished to advocate, has reached its end. According to him, the epoch of the forgetting of being continually proceeds as the age of technological development. This is the focus of the later Heidegger's view, an extremely abstract view in which Bolshevism, fascism, and Americanism amount to merely three versions of the same assault on beings as a whole. We need not emphasize that views like this cannot remain at such lofty heights. What is supposed to be prepared for, with anticipation for the future, is not only another epoch of being, but also another era of formative thought. Other thinkers are supposed to replace the exploitation of beings with an ethics of conservation. Heidegger's political excursion comes to an end with his quietistic turn. The rest is damage control. I would like to conclude by observing that the question of whether we can or should somehow associate ourselves with Heidegger today is no longer urgent, as it was for those who worshipped him in the 1950s and those who condemned him in 1964, the year in which Theodor Adorno's polemical text, Jargon of Authenticity, appeared, or 1987, the year of the uproar around Farias's work. This is mainly because what used to get people worked up about the philosopher of history is now a distant concern to us in 2015. If a philosopher in 1933 allowed himself to be gripped by the imperative forwards to history, well, this hardly still seems to matter to contemporary intellectuals. Philosophy today has little more to say about the phenomenon of history other than that it cannot be completely over. Incidentally, we no longer really know what quote-unquote history is supposed to mean when we abandon its narrative form. In any case, we dread the quote-unquote grand narrative. The status quo is expressed in the rallying cry, "Back to morality," which has since come to dictate the agenda, sometimes also in the form of "back to religion." The new situation offers the advantage of rendering the seduction of philosophers by an opportunism that goes along with the times powerless. There cannot be another Heidegger. Outside of the Guild, it turns out that opportunism no longer needs the pretense of history and its metaphysics. Office hours and business practices have absorbed so-called being and its history. A post-ontological and post-historical modus operandi is virtually ubiquitous. The only connection we still have to Heidegger's era and its agitated forms of thought can be appreciated with a figure of speech. Quote, "Time gives us problems, and we have to solve them," End quote. That is the small price we must pay for an engaged life. If Heidegger wished to overpay, we see that as his problem, no longer ours. The real cause for concern today is the fact that the current politics of the United States are an alarming sequel to the European and German drama of the 1930s. Having considered Heidegger's case, we can now better understand the dangers of a forward-charging regression into a time when history was not the right history for the course of the world to come. If Europeans today consider it anachronistic that America is regressing into an avant-gardism that is also at the same time unilateralism, this very regression seems to be the historical mission of the ideologists at work in Washington. A certain speechwriter wrote the following statement for George W. Bush to read in 2001, quote, "The call of history has come to the right country." And additionally, "We meet here during a crucial period in the history of our nation and of the civilized world. A part of history has been written by others. The rest will be written by us." End quote. Europeans should know that not much can be said to people who want to make history. Given this, we should try to explain to those of our American friends who can still be reached by arguments that neither God nor being have dictated Bush's speeches and wars, but rather speechwriters. In light of our experience, we must demand an explanation from these writers and compel them to tell us what exactly they mean.